we jump into it, we are recording this webinar tonight, so please do your best to keep your cameras and mics turned off for the most part, so that they don't show up on the recording. There'll be lots of opportunities for discussion and questions throughout. So keep your thoughts for those. Chuck some stuff in the Q&A as we go if something pressing jumps into your heads that you'd like addressed. And we'll get to those at a logical point or at the end if it doesn't fit in the presentation. But yeah, there will be a chance in the middle for you to contribute to the conversation as well and have a bit of a discussion with our presenters. So yeah, we look forward to that. We are, of course, talking about ecological thinning tonight, so it's a big topic. It's one that often grabs people's attentions, and people have got various ideas about what it is and what it is not. So we're here to talk about what we think of ecological thinning and our approach to it, and certainly what we don't consider to fall under responsible ecological thinning. Just before we get started, we're going to pop up a very quick poll, just one question for you to select an answer for as we get going, just to give us all an idea of where everyone's at in this discussion in terms of how familiar you are with the topic. So if you could just, whenever that pops up on your screen, very quickly just pick the option that best fits you, and that'd be really useful as we get into it. On behalf of everyone at Biolinks Alliance, a really big thank you to all of our supporters and donors. The work that we do isn't possible without your ongoing support. So thank you very much. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce tonight's presenters. So we've got Cameron O'Mara, who some of you will be very familiar with. He's Biolinks Alliance's Landscape Program Manager. He's been with Biolinks for a number of years now. Been leading the Spring Plains Watershed Repair project for the past 4 years, where we've implemented thinning along with a few other interventions, and he's now applying the learnings from this project to larger scale restoration across Victoria. We're also really fortunate to be joined tonight by Daniel Young, who's the Director and Principal Ecologist at Tailored Restoration, Ecology and Conservation, or TREC Land Services. Daniel's got many years of experience in the conservation and land management space, including establishing TREC in 2017. So that is enough from me. I'll hand over to you, Cam.
Thanks, Chris. All right, so ecological thinning. Just start by saying, reiterating what Chris already said, which is I've been managing the Spring Plains Watershed Repair project for the last 6 years, from beginning to current, monitoring and ongoing, basically. So that project involved a lot of ecological thinning, and all of the things that I've learned about this topic have come from that project. So it wasn't something that I was particularly well versed in, but I've basically spent the last 6 years thinking about this almost more than anything else at my job. So I suppose that's where my expertise has come from in this topic. I'm not a silviculturalist. I have a background in environmental management and sustainability, but I have spent the last 6 years thinking about this topic and implementing this and looking at all of the different ways that it's been implemented across Victoria as well, and other countries too. So yeah, there's a lot of information out there, and we've tried to synthesize everything that we know to this day about this topic in the systems that we work in. So to start, I'd just like to quickly touch on the history of the goldfields. You're probably all quite well aware of the fact that the central goldfields in Victoria were quite heavily degraded by gold mining activities in the 1800s. The gold rush absolutely decimated the forests all over Central Vic, and then successions of agriculture and timber harvesting, even up until as late as the 1990s and early 2000s, there was still quite a bit of timber harvesting happening in a lot of public forests, and Spring Plains is no exception to that, which is a site that I'm going to be talking about briefly as well. So this This is from out near Ballarat, I think just north of Ballarat somewhere. I'm not exactly sure where. But you can just see the level of tree loss that's happening there. And this was extensive all through Castlemaine, all through around Bendigo and all of those areas. And a lot of the first trees to go were the really large old trees, the ones that were good for railway sleepers and building out that system of transporting and moving things between the goldfields and ports and areas like that. So and you can see 83% of the original vegetation cleared. The box ironbark system is now one of the most endangered habitats in Australia, even though it's quite an extensive area that stretches almost the full length of the state. So this diagram just sort of is a way of looking at the thinning process visually that shows that the estate when it's unthinned, you can see that the trees are quite dense and they're locked together and they're sort of growing in this sardine-like formation where they aren't really putting on that much horizontal growth. They're sort of all reaching for the exact same resource. They're all coming up at the exact same time, shooting up for the sky and competing with each other for all of the same abiotic resources. So real estate is hard to come across, and it creates a market of, they can't compete with each other and they end up becoming stuck in this state where the trees are so packed in together that it takes quite a severe event to actually unlock all of the potential that the forest has to reach that state that it was like in the past. So ecological thinning is a way, when it's done right, and it can be done poorly, but when it's done right, it can unlock the potential of a forest like this and start to create the space and create the ability for those trees to begin to mature at a much faster rate. And that's actually been observed. There's plenty of research that's been done on the increased rate of growth on the residual trees, because obviously those trees are no longer competing with the other trees for water, for space, for sunlight, all of those things, for nutrients. And you end up with a faster rate of growth of those residual trees, and also a more productive understory, which is sort of shown there as well. You start to see mid-story and understory shrubs as time goes on. So the timeframes of this are not perfect, and those images are sort of, this was taken at Spring Plains, and that's 1 year later. And then this is another site called Pilcher's Bridge, which Parks Victoria did. Oh, sorry, this is Pilcher's Bridge. Parks Victoria thinned that about 20 years ago. This was done in 2013, that was thinned. And then this is the closest thing we have to a reference site for box ironbark in Victoria. We don't have many sites that can be considered true references because it's been so heavily degraded. So some of the closest that we have are sites like this one, where you can see there's some decently tall trees. They're not exceptionally mature, but they are somewhat mature with a decent understory and mid-story structure to them. So this is diving deeper into Spring Plains. So this map that you see here on the right is a representation of the area that Daniel and some other contractors were doing all of the ecological thinning in. The green area is where we thinned. So we chose a patchy application. So this was based on Parks Victoria's ecological thinning trials that they did about 20 years ago. And they did 4 different applications of thinning. And we chose this one, which was about a 48% reduction overall in stem density, and also about a 48% reduction in basal area. So if you were to measure all of the basal area of all of the trees across the entire site, we tried to reduce it by about 50%. So if you do that in a patchy area, it means you're trying to aim for about between a 50 and a 75% reduction across that area, but you're only cutting about 60% of the site. So we left 40% completely untouched, and there's reasons for that, and I'll potentially go into those in a little bit. So yeah, the area up here is the exact same spot as it is down here, just 1 year later, and it's exactly 1 year. So you can just see that the difference in the canopy separation, the amount of light that's filtrating in through the canopy into the mid-story and understory is just so much higher. And there's obviously all of these logs laying on the ground as well. So we retained 100% of the coarse woody debris as well. So Parks Victoria did various applications where they were removing some of the woody debris, but we retained 100%. So 1 year later, once we'd done all of our works, the average stem diameter obviously immediately goes up when you cut a bunch of the smaller trees, and that's what we were targeting, was the trees under 30 centimeters diameter at breast height. Obviously, by just doing that alone, just by removing those trees alone, you are increasing the average diameter of the entire forest. So the forest is instantly older, but also it begins to age faster as well. And that maturity is incredibly important, which is what I'll be going into soon. So this is that area that I was saying near Castlemaine. This was thinned in 2013. And this is the same site immediately across the road. So that's within 50 meters of one another, those two areas. So you can just see that the structure of the forest, the amount of understory, the amount of midstory, just the way that the forest is behaving ecologically is incredibly different in these two pictures. And I'm told by the landholder that this used to look like this. So, you know, and what you will find is if you go through these areas, you'll find species on the ground. You know, you find a decent array of different ground flora species, but they're just clinging on barely. And when you unlock the potential in the right way, you can actually stimulate that growth of those understory and midstory species. But yeah, what I've said, it is incredibly important to understand when thinning is appropriate and when and what exactly the type of outcome you're trying to achieve is. So yeah, incredibly important. So I'm going to dive a little bit into one aspect of this for forest maturity, which is hollow development. And Chris Zaroff said it best when he said that large trees with a trunk greater than 60 centimeters in diameter are 3 times more likely to be hollow bearing than smaller trees. And these large trees generally provide a greater range of hollow sizes for animals to use than small trees. So it takes about 120 years for hollows to begin developing on these trees. And when I say begin developing, that means that there might be one hollow on a tree that's that age that can be utilized by something that's small, like a glider or a phascogale or something like that. And it takes a significantly longer time for those medium and large sized hollows to develop. And the graph sort of shows that with these different tree sizes developing over different diameter at breast height measurements. So this is how hollows develop. Primarily, the main way that hollows develop really is just funguses. Funguses are the absolute key driver of hollow development. But all of these other things are factors as well. Things like termites, fires, wet and dry cycles, and beetles and other insects as well play a huge role in that process. But it's an incredibly slow process where branches have to fall off or dislodge, and then that needs to then rot out and become a cavity that an animal can actually live in, and that process takes an incredibly long time. So the idea is if we make the forest more mature, then that process will speed up and there will be more habitat for animals. And these are just an example of one aspect of forest ecology that is a good way of measuring success in terms of forest maturity. So it is an amazing visual representation of the types of hollows that you get developing on these large old trees. So an 18-meter tall tree provides 20 small, which is shown in orange, 4 medium, which is shown in yellow, and 11 large. And when we're talking about these different sized hollows, we're talking about, you know, gliders and things in those, maybe a squirrel glider in one of these yellow medium-sized hollows, and then things like greater gliders, owls, other, you know, large hollow dwelling animals that need significantly large hollows will live in those purple ones. So yeah, that's just sort of an indication of the types of trees that we're looking at. And these trees are incredibly rare, if not found at all in a lot of these conservation reserves that we have today. One other thing that we want to look at in terms of forest ecology with regards to certain species prevalence and things in the forest is perches and perch structure and how perches form and where do they form. So basically, we're looking at the complexity and the structure of the forest as a whole. So this image up here is just down the road from me, just really, really dense grey box regrowth. You can see there's almost no horizontal or diagonal branch structuring in that forest at all. This is basically a desert to a small woodland bird. Even though it may seem like a forest, it's really not functioning as a forest very well at all. It's more like a plantation. And we know that plantations don't function very well. This is down on the road between Tooborac and Seymour. And you can see that the structural complexity of a forest like that, which is still quite degraded, is actually significantly higher. So the number of spots where perching can happen and birds can move around through the landscape and perform their roles as ecosystem engineers is clearly much higher in a system like this than it is in one like this. And this work that's being done that looks at trees using LiDAR is actually trying to detect perching sites. And those blue lines indicate areas that can be used as perches and tries to map them onto individual trees and just shows the fact that, yeah, much larger, older trees obviously have significantly more than younger, more immature trees. And then one of the last things that I'll talk about is what we do with the wood once we've cut it. Like I said, we retained 100% of the felled material that we cut as part of this project. So two things that we did were place them in gullies as barriers to flow. So the goal with that is trying to slow down the flow of water and essentially create a series of leaky weirs. We did do those manually as well, but this is just from the slash. We basically just let it wash down and get caught in the stream and basically impede that flow. We also, this is on the upper slopes, laid the logs that we felt along the contours, and you can see upslope in these areas that the amount of vegetation growth on the upslope side, where you're getting that moisture retention and you're getting that microclimatic thing happening, and all of that buildup of organic material that's washing down the slope, hitting those logs, building up, and then turning into soil is actually very rapidly taking place. I mean, that's within 2-3 years of the interventions that we did. We're already seeing results like this, where that's pretty much in 100% native vegetation. Never mind the Scotch thistle that I pulled out just to the side, but there's, yeah, basically 100% native vegetation growing through these areas. So one last thing that I wanted to address was there's been a lot of chatter about ecological thinning, and I just sort of wanted to talk about the ways that this project is not trying to achieve the same goals that a lot of other ecological thinning projects are, and it is primarily focused on trying to understand ecological thinning for one. That's probably the main goal, is just trying to understand ecological thinning and to talk about it with as many people as we can to try and understand it as well as we can. But the second goal is to address a lot of the issues that people have with ecological thinning, and to do it in a way that that shows that it can be done without causing harm. And when it's done improperly, all of these things that are outlined in Lindenmeyer's recent work on this topic, we feel they can be addressed. And obviously the primary one is that this approach that is spoken about is using mechanical thinning, and mechanical thinning is defined as the use of heavy machinery to do thinning. And that was one of the stipulations that we had with Parks Victoria, was that this work needs to be done with boots on the ground and hand chainsawed rather than with heavy machinery because it would basically invalidate a lot of the ecological benefits that we were trying to achieve. So that was a real sticking point. They really didn't want us to do that, but we pushed for it, and eventually they said yes, which is phenomenal, and we are very grateful for them doing so. But yeah, there's plenty of things. This is all available online if you want to go and look at it. And if anyone wants to know more about our responses to all of these, I'm happy to speak directly with anyone. But we feel that all of these can be addressed, all of these issues can be addressed while still retaining all of the benefits of each of these points that Lynn Meyer brings up. And I think they're really good points to bring up as well. So now we are going to talk a little bit from hear from you guys, essentially. I don't know if Chris wanted to or Sarah wanted to say anything about this, but we're going to just ask, and anyone can. There's a little button down the bottom to put your hand up. I don't know if that's something, Chris.
Yeah, so either you should have the option down your bottom toolbar on Zoom to raise your hand. If you can't see it, it'll be in the little React menu on that bottom bar there. So rather than everyone just turning their mics off and kind of trying to speak at once, if you could raise your hand and we'll get to if you'd like to ask it in person. Otherwise, you can also put stuff in the chat if you have anything you want to add to the conversation or any questions at this stage for Cam. I guess keeping in mind we'll get into some of the more technical things around thinning with Daniel in a minute as well. So, yeah, over to you guys.
Yeah, Heather, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, Heather, feel free to unmute and ask away. Might just jump in first, Cam. There's one in the chat. Quick one from Catherine asking about when we thinned out the trees by chainsaw, how the trees regrew or were treated with chemicals.
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question. So some of the trees that we cut, we left unpoisoned. Some of them we used different poisons, but for the most part we used herbicide. And for the trees that we didn't cut, we got a pretty high rate of coppicing regrowth. And the best practice is probably to use the absolute least amount of herbicide that you can while still making sure that the tree dies. If you don't want to use herbicide at all, the example that I brought up from the place in Castlemaine in 2013, they got all the work done and then they went through with shovels over the next 13 years and knocked off all of the regrowth every 3 years, I think they said. And apparently all of those trees have now died. So you're basically exhausting the tree's energy and over time, causing it to die that way. So it can be done.
Great, thanks. Christine was asking about whether they would have to get permission from their shire for thinning. And before you answer that, Michael's asked kind of along a similar vein, I guess how to get the most success in terms of permissions on council land versus state parks versus private land. So I guess if you want to just touch on that whole issue around permissions and permits for this sort of stuff.
Yeah, it depends. It's a very it depends kind of question. There are some loopholes. So no matter what, you need a permit to remove native vegetation through DECA, which I believe Daniel's going to be speaking about soon. But depending on the zoning of your land, it really determines. Can Christine mute her?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Christine.
Should I speak?
Oh, you can go, Christine. Yeah, go for it.
I thought that with the DFAT thing, you could thin trees that were less than a certain diameter.
Yeah, so there are. Sorry, could you mute, Christine?
I will.
Thank you. Yeah, so there are loopholes like that. You would have to look into your specific local council. Trees less than 5 years old, and there's other things like within X meters of your
Yes.
property, you can thin and remove completely. So those kind of loopholes are available as tools that you can get around some of those issues. But a lot of the time, the forests that we're working in, the trees are well over that threshold. So if you were to remove trees that were less than 5 years old, for instance, I mean, you'd be removing very few trees and achieving not much of a result in a lot of these systems. So you really need to look into the local zoning that applies to your property, and then just call council or send them an email and just ask them. And they should be able to help you without requiring any kind of payment before having to go down the route of actually receiving a planning application for doing this kind of work. Was there any others, Chris, or should we move?
I guess just on that, while we're sort of on the permits thing, is I'm not sure if we totally sort of loosely covered Michael's question around most success in terms of getting permissions on different land tenures. And I guess, I mean, we've only had experience in a nature reserve. But obviously thinking about private land now as well. I guess just if you want to touch on how they differ.
I don't know if Michael's asking about most success in terms of oh yeah. So yeah, obviously private parks, private land is obviously much more difficult. There's many more barriers to working on public land than there is on private land. There's just some things that you don't have to do to work on private land. So we're going to be talking later about a project that we'll be doing that's almost entirely focused on private land and doing these kinds of interventions on private land. So we don't really know yet, but we're certain that it's going to be easier. And I know for a fact, because of the number of people that I've spoken to that have done it on private land, that they didn't have as hard a time as we did trying to get this project approved. So yeah, that's one of the reasons that we're focusing on it in that place. So yeah.
Guys, we've got Sue McKinnon as well with a hand.
Throw to Sue now, and then we'll get to a couple of bio-related queries in the chat, and then we might throw to Daniel after that, and we can come to more questions at the end of Daniel's presentation. So over to you, Sue.
Yeah, thanks. So as far as I can understand, the goals are to understand understand the logging that's been carried out, and to address the community questions that are in the community. In regards to understanding, I assume that you have a full assessment that's been written for this project by David Lindemeyer, another one from Phil Zylstra, perhaps some ecologist experts that are independent from the project. And
I would absolutely love for David and Phil to come out to the site. That would be amazing.
Were they invited? Were they invited tonight? And were they invited to the site and asked for an assessment?
Well, a couple of years ago, Phil came and did a talk at Heathcote. He was talking about all the burning that was going on in the forests behind Heathcote. And I did mention the project to him then. And I mean, I think he was interstate after he was going around doing a bunch of talks. So I told him about it then, but he didn't really seem that interested. And I know those guys have got a pretty negative view on thinning. And I guess, I mean, what we're trying to do is just come up with an approach that addresses a lot of those concerns. And I mean, we share those concerns, and it really isn't logging. We're not extracting anything. It's purely for the ecological understanding of what this type of approach can create, I suppose. So yeah, I mean, we'd be more than willing to have those. This is a fully open platform for anyone to attend. I don't know if it was sent directly to Phil and David, but yeah, all of the people that were on our mailing list definitely would have received the invitation. So yeah, I don't think we reached out to them specifically as part of this, but I know we received an email from groups that are associated with David and Phil. So yeah, I'd love to have them out. I think that would be amazing.
So Cameron, you've said that that you haven't reached out to people who don't have a positive view about logging, thinning, whatever you like to call it. I would have thought that would have been the first thing that we did. If we wanted to understand a project, we looked to the academics, we looked to people who are independent, and we certainly look to people who have a different viewpoint from us. And we do this in paper before we get our chainsaws out. This astounds me.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair enough. I mean, we've been talking about and speaking about this project for years now. So yeah, I don't know if it's ever come across their tables. I mean, we've spoken to many academics from CSIRO. Paul Foreman is the one who designed the whole project, and he's an academic as well. So yeah, I don't know if maybe we haven't done a good enough job of reaching out to those people specifically.
Have they been engaged and paid to do an assessment of the project? People that are not possibly of a different viewpoint, which we need in a debate and to understand, have they been engaged to write an assessment? You say this has been going for years. Have they been engaged to write an assessment of the project if the goal is to understand this logging process?
Well, I'll just start by saying we're not logging. We're not actually removing any material at all as part of this project. It is, yeah, we're just leaving the material on the ground and letting it rot like a fallen branch would. We're not trying to extract at all. And I'll also just state that the forests that are up in the high country behave very differently to box ironbark. They have different issues around them. There wasn't heavy logging in these forests like there still are up in the high country. These are very different ecosystems. We had no obligation to reach out to academics like David and Phil as part of the application. We had to go through a very strict set of legal processes to actually get the project approved by all of the bodies that are involved. That includes traditional owners, that includes Parks Victoria, DECA, the CMA, the catchment authorities. Everyone had to be a part of the approval process. So we just went down the channel. We don't have deep pockets. We're not for profit, and we are just trying to do ecological work. At the end of the day, we're trying to improve the health of the forest. So yeah, I would, but like I said, I would absolutely love for Phil and David to come and look at the site. That would be a dream come true.
You might just butt in there in the interest of time. Sorry, Sue. It'd be great to keep this conversation going, but we do obviously have time constraints. As Cam touched on, we haven't had budgets available to engage external experts to write assessments or reports on this project. Nor have we particularly had time and resources to specifically target anyone on either side of the debate to really come and be too hands-on involved, simply because we've been operating on the smell of an oil rag for a long time and with a very small team. So yeah, it'd be great to keep that conversation going and expand who we're talking to. But yeah, something hopefully we can pick up as we go. I'm just going to get to one last very quick thing, Cam, if you could touch on very briefly around fire. Tim was asking if we've had any thinned areas impacted by fire and how they respond ecologically, or do you think the thinning would benefit ecological recovery after fire? And Frank also had a question around how traditional cool burns fit with this type of measurement. So if you have a very quick answer to that, and then we can throw to Daniel.
Yeah, so fire, there's a lot of debate about the role that fire plays in box ironbark, specifically, and yeah, how much cool burning was a part of the historical regimes is not really well understood. So yeah, I'm probably not the best person to ask, but Paul Foreman has quite a bit of expertise on the role of fire. I don't know of any sites that have been burned after they've been thinned in the box ironbark specifically. And I should note that everything that I say tonight is specifically about box ironbark. Yeah, I'm not really sure of any sites that have been burned after they were thinned. But we do know that obviously thinning in the immediate term increases the fuel load in box ironbark, because you've obviously taken all of those crowns down. So the immediate result is that the fuel loads do go up temporarily, but over time they level out. I did have a slide in here, but I'd had to take it out for brevity. But yeah, they level out quite quickly. So timing of works is really important. Getting it as far away from the fire season is really important.
Awesome. Thanks, Cam. There'll be more time for questions after Daniel's presentation, but yeah, over to you now, Daniel.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Cam. This is going to be quick because we've already addressed half of this with the questions. So it's great to see, so many interested parties, and yeah, it's awesome to be able to talk to such an engaged group. My name's Daniel from TREC, and I guess the relevant part of that is that we've been doing ecological thinning more so in red gum woodlands, so constantly recruiting on, once again, a very, very different context to what we're talking about here. But we've had experience, probably 10 or 15 years experience now doing ecological thinning in red gums, and so it was sort of a logical thing for us to sort of branch out our reach a little bit and start thinking about some of the other areas that we could be contributing positively to in this space. We, as Chris said, we were one of the contractors involved in doing the boots on the ground work at Spring Plains. So some of this is general discussion about what's happening, and other stuff is quite very much specific to the Spring Plains project and the learnings that we took from that. This presentation was presented previously, pretty much these exact same slides at the symposium that Biolinks put on in Bendigo. So if any of this is familiar, that'll be why. But yeah, I think it's good stuff to be able to just go over again. And some of the stuff we'll be talking about, like most natural systems, they're going to be almost infinitely complex in their diversity and their differences from one site to another. So this is very much meant to be super general, high level. We don't think that anyone's going to be able to take what's gone on, what we're about to talk about, and then immediately apply it. This is sort of just a point where we can start the conversation, and then the questions that arise from that will if anyone's got any site specific questions they want to raise, then more than happy to go through that at the end. We've only got 20 minutes left, so I've only got about 6 or 7 slides, so we'll just try and move through it all pretty quickly, and we'll leave plenty of time for questions. So that's good. Straight up. Is this the first slide or is this the second slide? Sorry. Oh yeah, this is what
that's the first one. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's right. This is what we're talking about just then. So, this work that's going on and has been going on at the Spring Plains, and that will the future projects that we're working on. It's actually it's research that's gone on over the journey. Parks Vic have facilitated research. There's been a number of different ecological thinning projects over the years that have been run by academics and have been reported on. Everything's been measured. Everything's been analysed to within an inch of its life. I think the science and the understanding of what we can anticipate forests to do once they've been cleared, we sort of have a pretty clear idea on the direction they take after these works go on. And the key thing that Cam touched on is just forests that have been disturbed, they just end up being very homogenous. So when those disturbance processes all happen across a landscape all at once, you just lose those age classes. You lose the old forest, you lose the young forest. It all just ends up being very, very homogenized. And you end up with a situation where it doesn't really favor anything. The old forest has species that do really well in that system, and the young forests have species that do really well in that system. When you end up in this sort of stasis where everything is competing with each other and nothing really gets a leg up, you tend to find these forests, they do end up quite desert-like. They do end up with very few species of animal, and the plant species, while they might be present, they tend to occur in very low numbers, and that doesn't really function as you'd expect a forest to function. Okay, I'll go on to the next one. This is also building on a question that came up just before. You require a planning permit to remove, destroy, or lop native vegetation under clause 52.17 of the Victorian Planning Scheme. So that applies to the entire state. It's not a council by council situation. Although council administer the planning approval process, all of these would be referred to state government relevant departments. And so that's just something really to make sure that we are having these conversations around, with the regulators around what we're trying to do and what we're trying to achieve. And then you can get an exemption to the planning permit process. And the most common one that we'd lean on for this is a conservation work exemption. So you still need to go through the application process. But typically, if you're chopping down trees to build a house or chopping down trees to build a road, that area would have to be assessed and you'd be required to purchase offsets. This sort of circumvents that process. And that excerpt at the bottom of the page just basically comes straight from the DECA, that says it's dealt, but DECA documents pertaining to this. So yeah, these are processes you can work through, and the application process for a planning permit can be quite onerous, and the application for a conservation exemption is also reasonably onerous. However, it's more so that they just need to see maps and they need to see, GPS coordinates of where you're working, and they have some very, very specific requirements, but most of it makes a lot of sense. And the conversations we've had with the regulators over the journey is they're very open to this kind of work. They're not opposed to it. There's just some boxes you need to tick and some hoops you need to jump through before you get stuck in. Okay. So we've already touched on a lot of this stuff, so I won't dwell on it too much. But yeah, breaking that stasis seems to be from the research and from the science that's gone in these forests. It does appear that they reach a certain age and then they just stay there. Not age, sorry, they'll get older, but they reach a certain size, and as they get older, they don't continue to grow and then form hollows and do those things that old trees do that we love. And that's one of those things that are very, very different in these forests to, say, those tall forests of the Central Highlands or those mountain ash forests that you get. They have mass germination events, but then they self-thin very readily. That's not a problem up there. There's no real overwhelming reason ecologically to thin a mountain ash forest, because you'll get large trees and they'll just do their thing, and that's sort of how they function. I don't think these box ironbark forests would have evolved in the context of having mass disturbance events that completely reset the entire system all at once. There probably would have been sporadic germination events, and the large trees would have just persisted for very long periods of time. And so we've broken that cycle. So a lot of what we're doing here is sort of undoing some of the damage that occurred when we did mass clear a lot of these forests. The second point, so the understory species, the shrubs and the grasses and the sedges, super important species for a multitude of reasons. And often you'll go out and you'll assess a box ironbark forest and you'll do some quadrats or you'll do some flora surveys or whatever you do, and those species will still be there. Like you'll still find there'll be little bits and pieces hanging on, but they never really assume that sort of dominance that you'd expect from a really prolific, vigorous understory that's able to support the animals that live in those areas. It tends to be very open, very, very leafy. Sorry, very like leaf littery, lots of leaf litter on the ground. And then, yeah, some of the photos that Cam showed, they can be pretty depauperate. No, sorry, back one. We can help restore more natural hydrological attributes. So it's a big one. And we sort of touched on it with where we place the logs and how we manage some of the waterways and sort of slow the water down moving through the landscape. But also you'll often find many small trees will just use more water. They'll just consume more water than large trees will, large older trees. So when you've got a plantation type scenario, any water that does have the potential to soak in will just get used up by those trees. So it's not just about overland flows and restoring creek lines and, allowing water to sit in the landscape for a little bit longer. The actual water that soaks in will tend to get used quite quickly. Large trees are massively disproportionately resource dense, and there's some really awesome research on this. One of my colleagues did their honours on this project, a nice project on this topic. And the amount of nectar that you get out of one large tree that occupies, let's just say, 200 square meters is significantly greater than you get out of 40 trees that occupy the same 200 square meter patch. That's a really well understood phenomenon. And then you've got the hollows and you've got those other attributes that you get alongside at the horizontal perching locations. And we've already talked about that last one, but just those homogenizing factors that you get when you clear a forest and they all grow back at the same age. Habitat heterogeneity is a really significant, ecological underpinning of most of what we do, is keeping a bit of variation in the landscape. The way we tend to approach our in practice thinning when we're out there is I'd like to think of it as picking winners. So if you think about any other forest that thins itself naturally, you'll have trees that assume dominance and then the subordinate ones drop out. I think what we have in these forests is you might have a tree that's a little bit taller or a little bit bigger or a little bit stronger, but the subordinate trees don't drop out. They just sit there for a very long period of time, competing for moisture, competing for nutrients, just basically being a menace. So when we're out there trying to determine how we're going to approach our thinning on the ground, you would tend to just sort of go and find a tree that you think you want to keep rather than going and trying to find a tree that you think you want to lose. And then once you've got a tree that you think is one that will look good and live for a long time, then you start looking at the trees around it and start making some decisions about how you might approach giving that tree that you want to keep the best option to live a long and happy life. So those little trees around it that are really close to the trunk, that are already sub canopy, that sit beneath the overstory, they're the no-brainers. Their days are numbered anyway, but there's no reason for them to spend another 5 or 6 years sucking some moisture out of the ground and making that other tree struggle. They're really good ones to move. And then trees within the drip lines, if you've got large trees, anything within the drip line absolutely can just go. And then we tend to look at things like trees that we don't think are going to go the journey. So trees that have structural defects, and this is where a little bit of an understanding of tree health and what's a tree person? Arborist, arborist principles comes into it. So you need to have a little bit of an understanding of what sort of defects in a tree are likely to cause that tree to fail. So co-dominant leaders are a great one. You quite often see those trees, one half splits off and then the tree, tends to struggle from that point onwards. And then health defects, presence of epicorms, bracket fungi I've got there as a maybe because we've already identified fungi as being a key driver of hollow formation. So, we sort of need to be a little bit careful about going out and losing a tree that looks like it's unhealthy when the unhealthy trees are the ones that might give us another 30 years and might be a hollow somewhere about to form or in the process of forming. So these things tend to be you have to look at them with both a tree arborist type viewpoint and go, okay, if a tree is no good and it's going to fail, we probably don't want to leave it there competing with the trees that we want to keep. But also those trees that have those failure points, they're the ones that, at the very least, you'll get microbats in, or you'll get some small mammals, or some, a little kookaburra nest or something in a little hollow. That has value as well. So we really do need to balance how we assess these trees, with the objective of getting the forest old, but also the objective of filling in some gaps along the way. And things like mistletoe would be another great example of that, where, if you've got too much mistletoe in a forest, you've got a problem. And if you don't have enough mistletoe in a forest, you've got a problem. So you sort of need to be really quite strategic in your thinking, and really factor in what's going on within the matrix. So if there's a heap of mistletoe on the roadside next door, it's probably not that critical that that's retained within your patch. But if there's none anywhere and you're the only one that's got some, then it becomes a little bit more important. So yeah, looking at what's going on in the surrounding landscape can really give you some clues as to what you're likely to achieve. And then, yeah, once you've done all that, and you've taken out all the trees that you think are the obvious losers, let's say, then every now and then there's a good tree that has to go, just because it's too close, or it doesn't meet with your goals. So yeah, there are some good trees that come down, but for the most part, and most of what was done at Spring Plains, I would say 95% of what was done at Spring Plains fits in within these parameters. You go through, you take out the small ones, and then you stand back and you scratch your head and you go, okay, cool. That what am I looking at now? And then you take out a few that might be subordinate to the canopy, and then you stand back and you scratch your head and you go, this is cool. And so you I think I touched on this a little bit later, but spacing your work out over a couple of different years, or a couple of different time frames, can actually be really positive as well. So we don't need to bite everything off all at once, notwithstanding budget constraints and grants to be acquitted and whatever else. But yeah, having a bit of a staged approach can be really positive. So these are, yes, so there's some site-based considerations that you need to factor in. Holy moly, sorry, we've running over time. And these are really, really important. And these are the things you think about when you're standing in your backyard, or when you're out in a conservation reserve thinking about these things. First things first is just, you've got to be super safe. This is an incredibly dangerous process. Removing canopy trees, removing large trees is super duper dangerous. Yeah, if you're not sure, don't worry about it. And if you're going for a heterogeneic outcome, and there's some trees that are too dangerous, that are too close together, just leave them, and we'll call that your dense experiment. Like, we don't need to bite everything off all at once. We'll just walk away from it. Final tree spacings was quite scientifically done with Spring Plains. You can be as technical or as simple as you want with that. Desirable final tree species ratios. So yeah, this is a really complex point as well, because it's hard to know whether the current ratio of species that you've got represents the historical ratio of species. So if you've got all ironbarks and you go, clearly this is just meant to be ironbarks, you're probably mistaken. And if you've got all grey box and no ironbarks, it's probably meant to be some, but no one really knows. It's very, very hard to know this stuff, unless you've got photos or some historical data. You tend to just make the best determinations that you can. And if you're currently 20% ironbarks and 80%, grey box, then, I'd expect that you're taking out 4 grey boxes and 1 ironbark and keeping those ratios much the same. We talked about heterogeneity, log densities and arrangements. Yeah, you just want to run them across the slopes and try and slow the water down as much as possible, allow the leaf litter to accumulate, allow the soil to accumulate. Their germination locations for all manner of species, keeps it wetter for longer, allows more decomposition of the leaf litter on the ground floor. So instead of raining and then drying out and everything just stays how it is, things actually start to decompose, carbon cycles get re-established. Super important that we're able to sort of manage that as positively as possible. Site-based considerations around bushfire planning. As you're doing this work, you're going to have huge heads on the ground. you don't want to be doing that in October and having all these dead, eucalypt sitting at waist height come Christmas and January. So yeah, when you do that and how detailed you get with breaking it down so it all touches the floor of the forest is really important. Yes, if you've got Phasca and you know they're breeding at a particular time, I wouldn't go chopping trees down at that time. Maintaining habitat, yeah, we tend to just leave trees, even if they're likely to come, or if they're based on the previous criteria, should probably come out. If there's nests in them, leave them. If there's hollows in them, leave them. And then you might just leave a tree just because it forms a significant or an important function, joining a couple of patches together, or serve some other purpose in terms of allowing animal movements through the site. Canopy separation is important. That's what we're looking for. The stem separation is subordinate to that. So if you've got a tree that's bifurcated at the base, so it's been previously logged, it's got 2 or 3 stems, you can take 2 of the stems out, leave one. It won't be the world's greatest tree, but you actually maintain a little bit of genetics. So there might be something genetically different about that. So if you can retain individuals whilst still achieving separation, happy days. A multi-year approach, we sort of touched on that before. I just think going in and marking up all the trees that you want to remove on the first morning and then going and doing it is really fraught with danger. I think you want to go in, pick out the ones that are obviously not going to make it, and then have a bit of a think about what you want to do next, and just sort of look and see. If you do it over 2 or 3 years, that's fine. It's taken us a long time to get to this point, so there's no problem in dragging out the solutions. And then there's a point there about communication. Obviously, your neighbour sees you chopping down trees, they're going to knock on your door and ask the question. So, and there's an agency, so just your permits and communicating with everyone. Next one. I think we've just got a couple of photos. You can just skim through these, Chris. This is just, I'm sure there were some very specific reasons I put these photos in, but you can sort of see there's all sorts of stuff going on in those photos. Maybe back one. Yeah, you sort of see we've got the ironbarks and we've got I think they're grey box. There were some areas where we had red stringies, and there was only a couple of small areas of red stringies, and they were small and they were scraggy and they weren't very healthy, but we kept all of them because they were the only ones that were present across the whole site, so we retained them all. There were some areas where there was some red gums in the valleys. We retained them all because that was the only spot they were found. So yeah, it's a really great project to be involved. We're absolutely indebted to the Biolinks group for having us on board. And yeah, sorry, I didn't realize I was talking so slowly. We've pushed on a bit, but yeah, I'm happy to take any questions, and I'm happy to, if people want to send questions through to Chris or Cam, I'm happy to, continue the conversation offline via email or whatever. Just let me know.
No, that's totally fine, Daniel. It's not your fault. I just wanted to briefly touch on, we are going to be working with Trust for Nature on more of these kinds of interventions on a variety of properties all across Central Victoria. So we have a project that's being funded by the Ian Potter Foundation in partnership with all of those logos that you can see down the bottom, where we're going to be doing these interventions in a whole different range of environments to try and understand how this type of work can be applied. We did a lot more at Spring Plains than what was mentioned tonight. We were trying to address the hydrological factors as well. This was really just focused on thinning tonight. But if you want to look, we have other webinars that we've spoken about that you can find on our website, speaking specifically about Spring Plains. And there's a lot of information about all of the things that we did. But we're going to be doing that and a lot more into the future on this project as well. So if you are in the Central Goldfields bioregion, please reach out and join the project. If you've got a covenant, you can be part of the project potentially. And if you want to be involved in any way, we're going to be holding a lot of events in the future, so you can come out to some of those as well.
Thanks, Cam. Thanks, Daniel. Just before we jump into a few questions that we've got, thanks to everyone who's popping comments in the chat. Heather and Peter, it's great to see your comments on, I guess, your practical experiences with thinning and the outcomes and results that you're seeing. And thanks to David for some comments and insight around, I guess, the fire side of things as well. We had a couple of questions just before we jump into the chat come in advance via email, probably mostly specific to Spring Plains. So Cam, you might be pretty good to answer these. So firstly, would it be fair to liken the regrowth at Spring Plains to a natural forest regeneration after damage, like wildfire, and regeneration after severe felling from the past, in the last 200, 300 years, as we talk about at Spring Plains? So is that kind of a similar effect to what we see from, severe wildfires and things like that? And I guess how does it compare the way the forest responds to those disturbances?
I highly doubt that there's been as disturbing a force in these forests in the past, several thousand years as what has been done in this last few hundred. If a fire were to come through, that's a single event. But what's happened in these forests is actually multiple events on top of each other that have stacked on top of each other. So typically what happens is the gold mining comes through, clearing is done to access the areas. A lot of that timber is used to burn and build railway sleepers. And then the forest regenerates from that, and you get all of this coppicing regrowth. And then those timbers are then cut down, and the forest is typically grazed as well. A lot of the times that doesn't happen, but sometimes it does. Spring Plains was grazed after it was felled, and even up into the 80s, it was being grazed through there. You still find the odd sheep in there as well. Like it's the level of degradation is significantly higher than a single event or even multiple events. It's a continuous barrage of events that are happening one on top of the other. That's limiting the productivity and the biodiversity of these areas significantly.
Awesome, thank you. And another one which had a few comments in this question around some of the other stuff we've done at Spring Plains, but I guess broadly, how are we observing the impacts and changes to hydrology and moisture retention at the site? And obviously thinning plays a role in that with the logs that we've left behind that are helping to slow water down and build up organic matter. I guess the question was specifically asking if we're monitoring soil moisture at the site, but I guess if you can touch on some of the observations that we've seen around how water behaves at the site since we've done work there.
Yeah, we've done very rudimentary measurements. It's really hard to do proper soil moisture. We're not a research institute, like we don't have the funds to be able to. We have really big ideas about being able to do this stuff, and we want to measure ephemeral moisture content. We've done things like baseline soil water infiltration tests to see how well the soil actually infiltrates water into it. But we haven't had the ability to redo those tests after the works have been done, and we're not even sure they'll tell us what we actually want to know, which is how do these waterways behave after ripping and thinning and ponding has been done, and all of that slash material is on the ground, impeding the flow of water through the landscape. We really don't know scientifically. We've observed a lot. We've done things like where we've put in ponding and things. We've put up time-lapse cameras showing that water does infiltrate into those, and then it takes a lot longer for that water to escape. And obviously the energetic flow of that water through the ephemeral waterway is much more gentle. When it hits a barrier and has to then fill up a water body and then go around, it slows down that water. So we've observed it directly, but we haven't measured it directly. So it's really difficult. We have big ideas though.
I'll add to that. We are chatting with a group called TREC Labs to try and incorporate that into this new project, so that before we get started, we can actually, if we can manage to get some soil moisture sensors out at a subset of the sites that we'll be working on, to actually be able to have some quantifiable data around this, because obviously at the end of the day, that's kind of how you really prove these points to a broader audience. So fingers crossed that gets up and running, but watch this space on that one. A quick one in the chat from Bianca. Lots of pics showing understory coming back. I guess, what are we finding with the understory, midstory? Is it mostly sift and bush, or are we seeing, I guess, that diversity of what should be there, and what sort of other things are we seeing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the things that we've observed, and we've put in kangaroo, macropod, and rabbit exposures on the site, and observed how the understory vegetation responds to that. And obviously, the understory is being quite heavily suppressed by browsing and grazing. And what we're seeing is, with all of the slashed felled crowns, and I don't know if you've observed this as well, Daniel, but those areas create little micro exclusion zones all over the landscape. So you get these areas where, if a crown is laying on top of an area where there's some red anther wallaby grass and maybe some orchids or whatever, that those orchids are then protected from trampling and from browsing and grazing, and choughs can't get to them and all of that. So you're actually seeing an increase in growth in those areas, and you're getting these little tiny pockets of biodiversity appearing all over the landscape, which are really interesting. And I have some photos to highlight that as well. I didn't put them in the slides, but I don't know if you've noticed that in the past as well, Daniel.
Yeah, absolutely. Even to the point where if we're doing re-veg, we'll often not use guards and just put some branches over it, and you get better results. I think the wallabies actually go looking for the tree guards. I think they're clued into what we're doing. So yeah, that idea that you get some biomass, some elevated biomass that provides some buffering, is really positive. And then you probably get some moisture retention. It's less windy, the wind goes around it instead of through it. There'd be a whole heap of benefits to it.
And if either of you want to touch on any of the really key sort of those understory species, I mean, obviously we do see, a predominance of sift and bush, and also things like gold dust wattle. But I don't know, Cam particularly spending a lot of time at the site, anything that you've noticed more of in the
obviously
understories?
when you do these kinds of interventions, Cassinia sift and bush is a really immediate response species that will grow after any kind of disturbance, and we are introducing more disturbance into these forests when we do these interventions, especially things like the ripping and the ponding and stuff. But the thinning as well will increase the rate of Cassinia growth. So we're monitoring that as time goes on. There's certain patches where it's higher than others. Some areas there's basically none that's come back, and it's stayed exactly as it was prior to the thinning. Some areas where it's come back with a vengeance. So yeah, we're monitoring that to see what happens, because obviously that has implications for fuel loads and things like that. But the common sort of understanding of Cassinia is that it's a successive plant. It will over time decay and sort of go through that cycle process and eventually reach a background level. But within those areas where there is a lot of sift and bush, we're not seeing it outcompete other species. And we're actually seeing increases in certain like understory woodland birds and things as well, we've observed, Chris. So yeah, I don't know if you've seen any of that
Thanks.
in your travels.
The thing I saw that was probably most telling for me was where some of those rip lines were put in. You actually had a lot of orchids and chocolate lilies and vanilla lilies and all of those species that you typically associate with being, I guess, removed from the system when you have disturbance. Like they're the ones that it's like, oh, clearly it hasn't been disturbed because there's orchids here. We actually saw quite a lot of orchids growing right along those rip lines. And so that was something that caught my eye. It was a bit, I guess, if you'd asked me to predict what had happened, I wouldn't have predicted that. So I think some of that opening up and some of that ripping that was done, that I think people would have been quite critical of, for a justified reason, didn't really seem to have any detrimental impact as far as I could tell. So yeah, that was something that I was actually quite surprised by, and is probably worth noting somewhere. There'll be some photos around that we could share. But yeah, that was sort of the opposite of what I would have expected. I would have expected those species to be disadvantaged by soil disturbance, but they didn't seem to be.
Great. Thank you both. And Sue's got her hand up. If you can unmute.
Yeah, thanks again. We'll go back to understanding. There was a question about fire in the forest, and there wasn't an immediate answer, which surprised me because DECA have done extensive research on fire history in box ironbark and have found that it's not prone. It's quite a unique forest, not prone to recurrent fire. There was a question about traditional owner burns. Again, part of that research found that there was no evidence of traditional owner burns in the area. The flora shows that flora has not developed in response to fire. So, you know, these things that I would have done before I got my chainsaw out. So the other research that I would have hoped to have been done would be about the cooperation between trees through fungal networks and through wind protection. And to remove the trees that are associated with other trees. And these trees work together to form the tallest possible forest for that location. And we are removing that. One, we end up with a shorter forest, and that is something that is irreversible. It is also something that increases fire risk because the crown is closer to the understory. And two, we end up with more wind in the forest. Now, these trees have grown up with a lot of wind protection from the other trees. Suddenly, we take away the wind protection, we're damaging what is left. And some valuable trees might go down because of the loss of the loss of wind protection. The other thing is that CSIRO have got a pretty, you know, that they have made it quite clear that the relationship between the wind speed in a forest is directly related to the height of the canopy and the density of the canopy. Now, what we're doing is we're opening up the canopy. So we're increasing wind speed. So, all right, we've got a forest now that is shorter and has more wind in it. And then we get more shrubs and particularly Cassinia comes back. What does that do to fire risk? Okay, now we've converted something that is a uniquely fire-resistant forest. And there's none like that in Victoria. And we've converted it to something that is far more prone to fire, higher fuel hazard, higher wind speeds. The ripping will affect every other tree that is there. And you would have seen that in the planning regulations where you cannot disturb the roots of a tree for more than 10% of that tree root zone, or you damage that tree. So even the trees left are now going to be affected by more wind, affected by higher fire risk, and affected by the ripping. I don't understand the ripping because clay is very absorbent of water. It absorbs the water very quickly and holds it. There is very little litter. And again, that DECA research on the history of box ironbark forest shows that it has very little litter that remains on the ground. And that's
I'm just trying to keep track of everything. I want to try and address all of the points. Can we loop back from the beginning, just to address the point about fire? So yes, the reason I didn't want to talk about it too much is because I wasn't the person who developed the project originally, and Paul Foreman is like an expert on all of that stuff, and he would have done all of that pre-work to understand all of that, rather than, you know, I am just the project manager at the end of the day. Like, my job is to implement all of this work and to monitor and understand it as it goes on. So Paul would be a much better person to talk to about that. But I do agree with everything that you said about that. One thing that I don't know of, and if you could point me to examples of thinning actually decreasing the height of trees in box ironbark, I'd love to see that, but I haven't observed that anywhere. And the other thing about the increased wind is obviously when you thin in an area, you're creating more space in the canopy for wind to get in. If you go into a windy forest, to a forest on a windy day, you see that there's obviously not as much wind hitting your face when you're in a paddock or whatever. So there's all of these little micro eddies and things that get into the forest and can increase the risk, especially on extreme fire danger days for forests like this. But the idea with thinning is that over time, the residual trees will actually fill those spaces again, but in a much more heterogeneous way and not as homogeneous, not as like straight poles. So they'll actually fill those spaces. So one of the arguments that I think addresses that really well is that this work shouldn't be done at a really large scale in one area. It should be done in a way that's segmented and isolated from other areas where those kind of effects are happening, and temporally as well. Like if you're going to do a bunch of thinning in one area and you want to get it done, maybe you should segment that work over many years rather than doing it all at once, because you will exacerbate those effects that Sue is mentioning. So yeah, we definitely want to address those and we want to understand them better. And I don't know about the height of the trees. Everything I've read says that the tree heights are actually that the trees grow taller once they're able to have the space between the surrounding trees to grow much higher because they have more available resources and things like that. So if you could point me to that research, I'd love to. And I can't remember where we're getting up to next. I'm trying to keep track of all of the things that you were bringing up.
You were touching on the ripping, Cap. So asked
Yes.
or questioned why we were ripping, and I guess the nature of these soils and what we've seen.
Yes. So one thing, we did measurements. I mentioned briefly we did measurements at the beginning of the project with something called a talisman tube, which is basically a big tube that you fill with water, and it has a measuring tape on the back. You dig a hole in the ground and you stick it in the ground and you watch how long it takes for water to infiltrate into the soil. So some areas we did this, and in the gullies, for instance, you would put the talisman tube in the gullies and you would watch the water come down and you would count over the next 45 minutes how long it would take for that water level to go down. And it would just keep going down, but you're trying to measure the rate. So in the gullies, that's what would happen, where you've got that alluvial, soil that's sort of building up over time, that's more able to absorb moisture. If you did it anywhere up the slopes, even slightly in these areas, the areas that have been completely flogged from gold mining and over timber extraction, and they've lost all of their topsoil, if you did that in those areas, you stick one of these talisman tubes in this specific site, the water would just stay exactly where it was when you filled it up. It would not move an inch. It wouldn't move a millimeter even. So the test was over in less than a minute, basically, because there's basically zero infiltration. So we get these sodic soils, which is where this site is. They're very hydrophobic when they're dry. They sheet off water when it rains, and you get these huge erosive forces moving through the landscape. So I'm not exactly sure which sites you're talking about, Sue, but I would, if you could show me those. But this site might be slightly different.
Sodic clay absorbs water to the point where it becomes almost liquid. It's very prone to tunneling erosion. And
yes.
if you encourage pooling, you can start off a tunnel, and then you've got a long time to recover from that.
Yeah, so the idea is that you don't create large pooling where the speed of the water is increasing. You create many small ones throughout the landscape that all interact with each other and infiltrate into each other, is the idea. So you're trying to slow water across the entire landscape, and that's done through the use of coarse woody debris, through the rip lines, and with the ponding as well in the gullies. So yeah, I mean, it's at the end of the day, I mean, this stuff is still being looked at and studied in these contexts. So if you'd like to come out and have a look at the site and see for yourself what the impacts are, I'd love to show you around.
Cameron, I would like to. It is state forest. It is state owned, taxpayer owned, and
it's nature conservation reserve.
Yes, it's all Crown land.
Yeah.
So I would like to look at all the research that's been carried out. If in our democratic process, we elect governments and they do the management in the forest. I don't agree with a lot they do, but it is transparent. We can find out information about what they do under freedom of information. There is engagement processes that invite everyone to contribute in a democratic process. It may not listen to all those things, but you can see submissions from experts on the matter. Now, this is very, very different. This is where we've got Crown land, and you're telling me that there was an experiment done about hydrology. You're telling me that you looked at baseline fuel moisture, but you didn't look at it again afterwards. There is some measurements that you've done, and I would like to see all of those. If it was a government process, I could just ask under freedom of information, but I don't know how to get those.
Well, we're happy to give it. We're happy to be very transparent with all of it. I mean, we have nothing. The whole idea of this project was to be. So Parks Victoria did a bunch of thinning trials, much larger ones than what we've done in 4 parts of central Victoria. One of them is just down the road from this site at Spring Plains. So it's a mature example of thinning. And they did 4 different applications at that. One was just a control, and the other 3 one was thinned, basically 50% of the trees were removed. One was thinned, 50% of the trees removed in like a patchy application, and then one about 70% of the trees were removed in a patchy application. So some areas were left untouched, is what patchy means. So they already did this work 20 years ago to sort of see what was going on, but they never released any of the information publicly of all of the monitoring that they'd be doing afterwards. So we wanted to go and do it ourselves and integrate some other methodologies just to see what would happen when you do that. And that's what we tried to do with this project. So yeah, I'm not sure how much time we're going to have to keep going because I actually need to go and have dinner.
No, I'm going to have to. I would
love
step in
to
there.
keep talking to you soon.
Yeah, so feel free to. I mean, all of our email addresses, I think, are on our website. Yeah, reach out. Happy to have a chat. Happy to share what we've found so far. And I guess I will put on that as Cam mentioned. It's not new. We haven't gone into this blind. The thinning idea came about based on the Parks Vic trials, and honestly, in this forest, when you step into the plots that Parks Vic did their thinning trials in about 20 years ago now, it is objectively a much healthier, more functional patch of the forest. So it's not like we're shooting in the dark. It's all very much supported by evidence, and we are collecting evidence and monitoring data around what we're doing. It's also, we're monitoring long-term responses, and we've only been monitoring for 2.5 years post intervention so far, which is really not a long time to be talking too much about outcomes yet, because everything is kind of we don't quite know yet. So stay tuned. But yeah, I guess in the meantime, Sue, and anyone else who's interested, get in touch with us. We're more than happy to talk about everything we've done and what we've found so far. Big thanks again to Cam and Daniel as well for your time tonight. Thanks heaps to everyone who has tuned in. And obviously, if you want to keep up to date with what we're doing and our future webinars and events and things like that, remember to subscribe and sign up for our email list, follow us on socials and all of that. But yeah, that's all from us. Enjoy your nights, and thanks again for tuning in.